Science in pajamas, jammers, 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 jammers. Alright, you guys, so welcome back. Today we're going to be talking a bit more about behavioral genetics because that's the chapter we're in. And there's not a whole lot to really write on the board. There's not really much in terms of examples and Punnett squares. We're just going to kind of summarize it and why these things are considered what they are. When we talk about behavioral genetics, we're talking about anything that can affect your behavior. And essentially, what that is things that affect our behavior are things that affect our perception. Whether it's perception of the world around us, perception of things around us. Now, for the longest of time, and even still today, there's always been this argument right here: nature versus nurture, or in other words, genetics versus the environment. What contributes to the way we are? What is it that affects our behavior? Is it all based on our genetics? Is it all based on our environment? And people have their own different views on that. But in terms of from a geneticist standpoint, why not both? And I'm actually saying that in all seriousness. A lot of our behavioral traits are what we consider multifactorial traits. That means that there's both a genetic and an environmental component. And it's both of them that lead to the expression of these traits in different ways. For instance, now the thing about these, I do have to put a disclaimer on there, is that a lot of these are touchy subjects, so fair warning. These are very, very sensitive, and sometimes it does lead kids to be a little more uncomfortable in this chapter, but I think, at least from what I've noticed when teaching it, kids also find this one the most fascinating because it is so relatable. Now, for each one of these behavioral traits that we're going to just briefly touch on, for more information on each of these, see our chapter video lesson. But in terms of these, there are genetic variations that are caused by something in the genes that are triggered by something in the environment. However, there is also versions of these that are purely environmental. So, eating disorders, for example, we do study these when we talk about behavioral genetics. Now, eating disorders can include, and the ones that we specifically mentioned in class are anorexia nervosa and muscle dysmorphia. Anorexia nervosa is when no matter what, you always see yourself as too big, fat, undesirable, and it doesn't matter how skinny you are, that's how you view yourself. Muscle dysmorphia is kind of the opposite. It's when you always see yourself as too small, too scrawny, so you do everything you can to bulk up, to get as much muscle mass as you can, but no matter what you do, you always see yourself as too tiny. Now again, remember how I said it all goes back to perception? There is something in how people with eating disorders perceive themselves that leads to these disorders. Whether it's because someone perceives themselves as too fat, thus leading to anorexia, or they perceive themselves as wimpy and scrawny, thus leading to muscle dysmorphia. But it all goes back to perception. Now, again, there can be both genetic and environmental conditions. There are certain cases where, in terms of, let's say, anorexia, it can be purely brought on by the environment, by, just always being told that over and over that you're not good enough, you're not pretty enough, why don't you lose weight, why don't you eat less? Seeing all the, movie stars and pictures in magazines and all those photoshopped celebrities and models, it gets very disheartening because you always see that and you're always like, why can't I be that? No matter what I do, I cannot get that way. Well, first of all, those are unattainable standards. but that could lead someone to just feel so bad about themselves it can trigger an eating disorder. However, there are some cases where there's something in the genes that also affects the perception of someone. So they can be told their entire life how beautiful they are and how wonderful and that they are gorgeous and skinny and everyone wishes they could be like them. But there's something in their genes that changes their perception of themselves. So no matter what they're told by everyone, they still see themselves a certain way. They still see themselves as not good enough or too fat, or in the case of dysmorphia, not strong enough, so wimpy, no muscles. And because of that, it then triggers the eating disorder. So there are environmental causes, that there are cases that are 100% environmentally caused, but there are also versions of these eating disorders that have a genetic component triggered by something in the environment. And that trigger can be just about anything. It all depends. If we look at depression versus bipolar, or depression and bipolar or anxiety, these are all mood disorders. There are purely environmentally caused versions of this. If you go through a traumatic event, or you've been to war and come back with PTSD, or someone who you love, who means the world to you, dies, or you break up with a significant other, that could lead to an environmentally caused mood disorder. It could lead to depression and things like that. However, there are also genetic versions of these as well. And that's why these behavioral genetics are so both fascinating and difficult to study at the same time, because there are purely environmental versions and then there are also genetic versions. So, for instance, for the depression one, if there's something in your genes that prevents the proper uptake of serotonin. So serotonin is the happy hormone. Now what happens in serotonin is so these are two neurons. This one is sending out the signal and pretty much releasing the serotonin. Now what happens is normally the serotonin will bounce around for a little while, hitting the receptors and thus stimulating the good feeling, the happiness, into this neuron, which passes that feeling along. And then eventually it does get reabsorbed back into this guy. But what happens if instead of it bouncing around for a little while, maybe just not that much is made? So instead of the usual amount of serotonin being produced and released, there's not that much. So even though it'll spend the same amount of time between the neurons, since there's not as much of it, there's not much of it reacting with the receptors, so you're not going to get that feeling being passed on before it gets taken up. Now that's where certain medications come in. They're called SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. What they do is they will block the serotonin from being reabsorbed right away. This way, the serotonin that is there will spend more time bouncing along the other neuron, reacting with the different receptors so that the full effect can still be passed on. Now, this is something that's always irked me. A lot of times, many of these behavioral disorders, whether it's anxiety, eating disorder, addiction, or mood disorders, are oftentimes treated as, less than what they are. It's just people telling those with depression, you just need to get happy. You just have to stop being sad. It's not that easy, especially when it's something like this. I mean, if it's your serotonin levels are not normal, then how can someone just be happy? It's not that simple. So, what I tell my students when we teach this unit is don't listen to the haters. Do what you gotta do to make yourself better. What I mean by that is, would you tell someone who has cancer not to seek treatment? If someone has a broken leg, would you tell them just to walk it off, that they'll be fine? If someone has diabetes, do you tell them you don't really need insulin? You just got to get over it. No, you wouldn't, because that is dangerous and irresponsible and it can lead to serious health effects. Why would you tell someone with a mood disorder the same thing? Why would you tell them those things? You take insulin. If you have diabetes, you take insulin because your body is not producing that chemical. That's okay to take this supplemental version of it. Just like with a mood disorder, if you need to take medication for it because your body's not helping you to make enough serotonin or to use it properly, then go for it. It's okay. People always just assume that these things are, you choose that. You choose to be sad. It's not that simple. And even depression, it's not just being sad. Most of the time, it's just a feeling of emptiness, of worthlessness, of just being tired all the time. It's not just being sad. It's like a small part of it. It's just not feeling good. It's that lack of goodness in you. And I don't mean good as in evil. I mean just, what am I doing here? What's the point? Nothing is going to get different. It's okay to seek help, you guys. Whether it's for an eating disorder or a mood disorder or even addiction. A lot of times people have the exact same unhelpful thoughts about addiction. Okay, so someone's addicted to alcohol. They just need to get help. They just need to stop drinking alcohol. It's not that simple. It's really not. What happens with addiction of any kind, but I'm going to use the example of alcoholism, is once again, it affects your brain chemistry. So when you drink alcohol and you get drunk, or if you take another drug like cocaine or heroin and you get high, it causes certain, euphoric, happy, it releases certain hormones that we associate with good things. Now, normally, let's say your body makes this level of serotonin throughout the day. But then when you take a drug, it goes up to that level. So it's higher. Now, because you're getting that supplemental creation of that feeling, your body over time, and this is kind of what dependency and tolerance lead to, your body stops making as much because you're getting a synthetic source that is causing a greater reaction. So why should your body have to make it? This is why withdrawal can be so bad. It can affect the different body systems, and this is why a lot of times people with withdrawal, who are going through addiction withdrawal, end up becoming depressed for a while, because once you take this away, the body is used to making this much again. It's not used to making its normal amount. So it takes a while for the body to retrain itself to go back to normal. Now, here's the thing about addiction. It's not easy. That's what tolerance and especially dependence is. Those are the two characteristics of an addiction. Tolerance is you build up almost like an immunity to a certain level, and you need more and more of it to reach that same level. You hear people say that, oh man, I used to be able to run on one cup of coffee, but now I need like 2 or 3 cups of coffee to make it through the morning. Oh, that's because they've developed a tolerance to the caffeine in coffee. It's not so much that they need more coffee, they need more caffeine. And they need the more caffeine to reach the same level of alertness because, well, caffeine actually is a drug. It's a legal drug, but we do get addicted to it. We do experience an increase in tolerance and dependency on it. People are like, oh man, if I don't get my coffee, I just can't function. Yeah, that's because now you're dependent on it. And if you've taken, caffeine sources, whether it's soda pop or coffee or whatever, but then you just stop taking it, you'll notice people tend to get grouchy and they have headaches and all that. They're going through withdrawal. So that's something to keep in mind. In terms of before people are like, but that doesn't mean that there's a genetic cause. Actually, yeah, there have been shown to be genes linked with addiction. There have been. And remember how we said it's a genetic factor that needs some kind of, come here. Okay. That it's a genetic factor, but it needs to be triggered by an environment or an environmental stimulus. Well, imagine if I have the genes for addiction, maybe for alcoholism. You often hear how that travels through families, and it is true. Because what it means is that someone who has a genetic predisposition to alcohol, what it means for them is that they need less of it in order to build up that tolerance and that dependency. So if someone, let's say hypothetically, a normal person, it would take 4 weeks of heavy drinking almost every day before they become an alcoholic. Someone who has a genetic predisposition, it might only take 2 weeks. So they still have to get up to that point. They still have to be exposed to it. If I have the genetic predisposition for alcoholism, it means that I can be exposed to less alcohol than someone else before I become an alcoholic. But if I never once touch this stuff, if I never once drink alcohol, then no matter what my genetic predisposition is, it's never going to be triggered by that environmental stimulus because I'm choosing not to drink alcohol, then I'm not going to be an alcoholic. So it's a predisposition. It doesn't mean that you are guaranteed, but it does mean that you are more likely to once exposed to the substance. But yeah, all right. So I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about those, how they work in terms of the genetic factors, and why it is okay to seek help if you feel you have an eating disorder, or if you're worried you have a mood disorder, or if you're worried about, being addicted. It is okay to seek help. Don't let the stigma of society tell you otherwise. Maybe if people didn't look down on these things and all that, more people would be willing to seek help. I mean, how many people have we lost to suicide because of eating disorders or mood disorders or because of addiction? Maybe if people felt more comfortable seeking help, this would be a non-issue. We have to cut out the stigma and just let people get help. It's okay for you to get help if you feel you need it. And I can say that out of personal experience. So please, if you feel you are experiencing any of these, talk to a doctor, talk to a teacher, talk to someone that you trust, and we'll do what we can for you. All right, you guys. There's my PSA for the day, I guess. So just, you guys, take care of yourselves. Your mental health is just as important as your physical health. But until next time, you guys, take care, stay awesome, stay amazing, and just be your awesome selves. All right, you guys. Talk to you later.